G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and today I'm going to be using Adobe Photoshop, and the methods I'm going to be talking about should be applicable to other programs, and I'm going to break down digital painting into 5 easy steps. Now, of course, there's not a specific right or wrong way to digitally paint, but recently I've been working on a lot of artwork for my upcoming book on character design, and I realized that in a lot of the processes I use the same basic steps. Now, I've also jumped forwards in time very quickly so I can show you these 5 steps before I go through them one by one and go through the whole process with you, but you'll be able to see very quickly right now what those steps are and how they each visually make a huge difference. So the first step is flat colors and setup. And this is where we put down the very basic flat colors, decide on our core palette for the character or whatever we're painting. Step 2 is the paint blocking. As you can see, this is where we very roughly put in the skin tones, hair tones, whatever shade and light goes into the image in a very rough way and start to allude to the gradients and the way that the light is going to be hitting, and we'll go through all of that detail later. The next step, step 3, is blending. And basically, as you can see, all this does is really smooth and soften the transitions in these shadow and light tones, and I'll go through how we do that with different brushes later. Step 4 is details, and this is where everything starts to really jump out, and we use different techniques like doing hair textures and also rim lighting textures and lighting on the edges of the character. And then the very last step is step 5, which is refinement, which is where we finalize and create our finished image by using things like dodging and burning, altering our saturations, and playing around with some textures and overlays. So that is the process, but as you can see from the end to the beginning, there's quite a dramatic difference between what we start off with and what we end up with. And we end up with something quite refined and ready to be applied to various contexts, and this is the style of painting that I use all the time, quite a lot, and specifically that I'm using for the book that I'm working on. And because I've been doing it so repetitively, I just thought it might be fun to go through the process with you with an image that, you know, might unveil the process to you if you're interested in painting in this way. And hopefully you'll find a few interesting tips and tricks through the course of doing this. So the first step, as you can see, I've got my image here. This is not part of the step. So creating the illustration or the line work or however you go about that, that's separate. So if you want to learn how to draw or do the line work and all that stuff, that's, you know, I have other tutorials on that, so feel free to check out the content on my YouTube channel. But that aside, I'm going to hide my construction work. I should mention on the offset that I'm using my custom brushes. These steps are applicable with other brushes. So you can use the Photoshop default brushes. If you use custom brushes by someone else, then that's fine. But if you're interested in what I'm using, these are my custom Photoshop brushes, which are available at JAZZA'S.com. So I've used the construction pencil, which looks something like this for the construction. Then my inking brush, which looks like this, for the line work, which you can see on top here. I work at high resolutions, and the inking brush has a really, really sharp contrast. So if you work at lower resolutions, it's going to look pixely. It's going to look a bit like that. But because I work at high resolutions and really wanted a very strong contrast, I, use that. But for the painting itself, I'm going to be using my paint brushes, and they look, let me just pick a random color. They look something like this. So when you press light, as you can see, it pastes it down lightly, and then as you press thicker, it builds it up. And we're going to use a few different methods to create some more three-dimensional looking painting stuff. But the first step in my 5-step painting method is flat colors and setting up the image. So by flat colors, I mean, quite simply, setting up the flat default colors to your image. Now, as you can see, I've sort of pre-prepared that with this image here. Basically, what you're finding is the very basic primitive palette for your image. So I've found a skin tone and a hair tone. I actually haven't colored in the other details of the face, the things like the eyes and the earring here, because they're pretty easy to go through it and do later. I have a layer underneath called Other in Photoshop, and I can just go through here and pick a color I want and paint that in there later. And as you can see, because it's on the lowest layer and I've already laid down the other colors of the skin and the hair, it's going to appear behind and at the back, so it's going to be easy to paint in nice and cleanly. So that's step one, putting down your very basic colors. Now the next step is the paint blocking. This is really the rough part, but it's also going to do the most. So to make this process really easy, I love to use a feature in Photoshop called clipping masks, and I talk about this in pretty much every Photoshop painting tutorial that I ever do. I'm sure there are other ways to do it in other programs. In Photoshop, it's really easy. You create a new layer on top of the layer you want to work on, and then you Alt-click the line between these two layers. And then what that does is it means that when I select a color, I'm going to select a slightly darker tone for the skin, bring my brush size up, and when I paint, even if I paint over the edges, obviously I'm not painting the skin like this, but as you can see, it stays within the parameters that I've set up. So that's why step one is really cool, because you set up the basic color, but it's also like the area that you're going to be painting in. Then in step two, we do the block painting. And how this works is we select the next color. Usually I start off with a deeper tone, a more shadow tone, and I start to paint in some of the shadows, and it can be really rough. And it is quite literally blocking in. It's where we're just roughing in the very basics of where the light's going to hit. So to do this effectively, you want to first decide where your light source is. I'm going to delete what I've painted and help you sort of figure out how we go about this. I'm going to set up a layer at the top with a guide for the light. So I'm just going to draw a little sun here. That's my main light source. Now we're going to get to lighting a bit later, because as we go through the refinement process, we're going to add other light sources, but we do our basic painting with one main light source, and then we can play around with that a little bit later. So now that I've decided where my main light source is coming in, you can see I've drawn a little bit of a 3D arrow, so it's a little bit more at the front and it's higher up. To select a deeper skin tone, you just click on your color palette here and you can pick the color of the skin that you have there. And usually what I like to do when I go deeper is go down into a slightly more saturated and darker area, and I also like to go a little bit more red. Now something that's also useful to do is set up a palette. So I'm going to paint this here on the left, and I'm going to select my base skin tone and paint that here on the left as well. And that means then when I go to my clipping mask layer where I'm going to paint the skin, so if I hold Alt and click on this darker tone here and then paint, you can see that I've picked that tone. And this comes in really useful because you can then select mid-tones between these colors. So you can see I have a very stark contrast between this darker area and the light base tone of the skin. If I hold Alt and click somewhere between here, I've picked a color between them, and if I paint nice and strong, you can see how that's sort of mid-tone. And that's how we create a very beginning aspect of blending. So we can just Alt-click, blend that out. So as far as shading goes and knowing where to put the shadow and where to put the light, basically where you have your light source is the strongest point of light, and when you're placing shadow, you just want to start to paint it in areas that are hidden away from that light. But that's also a gradiated thing. It's not an immediate stark black and white sort of thing. So we're finding areas like here next to the hair where it's not in shadow per se, but it's further away from the light source, and it's also near other objects and intersecting points where the light is being slightly hampered. So when we paint our first layer of shadow, we want to be nice and light with our strokes, and we want to sort of drag it around a bit and make it nice, give it a little bit of extra coverage. Now I honestly think my base skin tone is a little bit too yellow, so I'm going to change that. And to change that, I'm just going to select a magic wand, go to my base layer and just select this, and then I can go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and all I need to do is bring the hue across to more of a pink. So that's more of a yellow. If I go to the left, see it's on -3. If I try -5, see what that looks like, and that's much better, and hit OK. So as you can see, if I undo that, between the two, I've gone with much more of a pink tone, and that's much nicer as far as skin tones go. So I go back in my clipping mask layer and finish off my first tone of shading. Now do keep in mind that this stage of painting, stage 2, is blocking. So don't worry too much about it looking smooth, because we're going to come back and do that later. Really, we're worrying about light and shadow placement. So I'm going to go up to my palette layer, select my darker tone and go a lot darker and a bit more red. And I'm going to paint this down here. And as you can see, that's my next layer of depth. And going back to my paintbrush and my clipping mask layer, I'm going to grab this and start painting down a darker tone, bringing up my brush size, and I'm giving it a little bit more room to breathe. So I'm only painting this darker tone in the deeper areas of the skin, in the areas most hidden away from the shadow, so particularly under the jaw and chin, this area here along the neck, and I can bring my brush size up and just paint a lot lighter to add to that gradient sort of look. And then also here where things are a little bit hidden away from the light and where it's near intersecting parts of geometry, so the hair and the skin. And then we have the back of the head here. So as you can see, I'm laying down the base tones and I can start to do a bit more of that blending. So it's not going to be really refined blending. I'm just basically evening out the tones that I'm putting down by alt clicking between these areas and painting down these mid tones. And wherever I want it to be lighter, I'm alt clicking in a little bit more of the lighter area and dragging the shadow back by painting over it. And then if I want to bring the shadow out more, I can alt click on the shadow color and drag that out again. And this is a process that you sort of repeat in this blocking process until we find the areas of light and shade that we're happy with. Particularly in areas where there's a bit too much of a contrast between the light and the dark. So for example, here in the neck, it goes from very light to very dark very quickly. Whereas if I alt click in the middle here, I can paint quite broadly in this middle area and that drags it out. And again, if I want to do further blending, basically you can create that gradient look by alt clicking in these middle areas and then dragging them out and between each other. And as you can see, we've created much more of a gradient along this neckline by using that alt click painting thing. So what I like to do is go from light to dark in the beginning, and I also like to go to a very dark. So I'm just going to find one last very dark color and add it to the palette. Select this, and in my clipping mask layer, only in the very deepest areas. So for example, here in the ear, in the deep cavities, and then here on the very, very bottom of the neck, I'm just going to paint this down underneath the hair here, but I'm still going to gradient that out slightly, but nice and quickly. And then immediately under the nose, under the eyebrow, under the lip, and in the corner of the mouth there. And then as a result, we have our basic lights to darks. And then the next thing I like to do is add another layer to the clipping mask, and you can do this infinitely. So I'm going to add a new layer to the skin area and add it to the clipping mask again by alt clicking this area here. And then that's added it to the clipping mask. I'm going to select my lighter skin color, my base skin color, and now I'm going to add a lighter tone. I'll bring it up to be a little more yellow, a lot lighter. I'm going to add this color, this lighter color, to the skin tones. And what you could do if you wanted to is build your palette at the very beginning. So I'm going to add maybe another lighter tone down here. Might even go lighter than that. And if you pre-build a palette, you can just sort of go back and forth from it while you're in the layers that you're working on. So back to my paintbrush. Now you'll notice if you're using my custom brushes, there are several different paintbrushes, and I'll go through those in a moment, but the one I'm working with for all of this so far is just my default paintbrush. And at the top here, we have construction pencil, ink brush, and paintbrush. I'm using paintbrush. So I'm going to eyedrop and select with Alt, click that slightly lighter highlight, and now I have a new layer for some areas of highlights, and I'm just very softly adding these areas that are going to be facing this light source. I do the shadows first because shadows are present in the absence of light, but I do the light on a layer above the shadows because wherever there is light, it's again in front of the shadows. So it's important to make sure that they're not hidden behind the shadows that we've already painted. So you'll notice that with the light being placed down, we are going to override some of the shadows that we've already placed, and that's okay because that's what light does. So the light is going to catch the neckline there, maybe up here a little bit, but in particular the cheeks and the forehead, the tip of the nose, the lower lip. And as you can see, there's quite a dramatic difference between when you add the light and remove it. So while it looked fine with just the mid-tone to the dark tones, adding the light is really going to make your piece pop. Now this is all still the blocking phase. This is where we're roughing in the shades, the lights and the darks. And in the same light layer, I'm going to select my brush, eyedrop my lightest color, and then just lightly paint it in up here, just in the areas closest to the light source. So that's it. That's the blocking for the skin done. Now I'm going to repeat the process with the hair. So I'm going to add a layer, create a clipping mask, and I'm going to pre-build my palette. So first I'm going to select my hair color, and then I'm going to go a darker tone, maybe a touch more red, hit OK. And this is going to be my hair palette. So I have my base hair color, a darker hair color, a darkest hair color. And then going back to my mid-tone, I'm going to go up to the lighter colors like this, and then going a little more yellow and a little lighter with a touch of saturation. I'll go like that. So that's my palette for the hair colors. I've pre-built my palette. Going back into my hair clipping mask layer with the brush and paintbrush selected, I'm just going to go down tone by tone. With quite a large brush, block in the area, and you'll notice that now that I've sort of demonstrated how to do it, I can just whack it in and you sort of know what I'm doing. But really the blocking process shouldn't be too time consuming. We're just really roughing in the basics of how it should look. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to move a tone down to my darkest tone. I'm just going to do these edges here behind the ear where there's no light. Now, the good thing about hair is because it's a little different to skin, skin has a much smoother surface texture, whereas hair is quite rough. Now, we're going to add some hair texture later, but we're starting off with our blocking, and the blocking itself can be quite rough compared to how we've laid down the skin. I'm going to add a new layer to my clipping mask and select my slightly lighter hair tone and start to paint this in areas closest to the light source, like so. And again, this can be nice and rough. This doesn't have to be very pretty. And then finally, my lightest tone is going to be minimal and closest to the light source. So again, I'm just sort of very quickly squidging them in. So that's almost my basic blocking done. I've done all the hair and skin blocking, very rough blocking. So now I'm going to add my final areas of blocking. So to start off with, I'm going to go into the lips by adding a new layer in the skin tone. I'm going to select the lip color and then just make it nice and pink and go in there and paint it. And I can just paint it right on top because it's on its own layer now without worrying about affecting the skin tone underneath. Now, when you're painting mouths, always remember that the top lip is much darker than the bottom lip. Even though lips are essentially the same color, the top lip is angled in a way that light is not going to hit it very easily unless the light's coming up from underneath. And in most cases, the light source is above the character. So that's why in most cases, shading the upper lip is always darker. So there you go, that's the lip roughly shaded. And then on my other layer, I'm just going to very quickly and easily lay down the other colors. So we have the green of the eyes, do some nice green eyes, and then we'll give her a blue earring. And I can just erase where the highlights are. So the next step, step 3, is what I call blending. Now I know I'd sort of explained it roughly and did a little bit of blending before, but I'm going to explain the difference between the step 2 blending and the step 3 blending. I've done the step 2 blending. That's the very rough blending between light and dark areas to create the rough gradients. But the blending step, step 3, is going to be really smoothing things out and getting much more gradiented, smooth, pretty tones. So I no longer need my reference here. I'm going to delete my palettes and light source because we know what we're working with now. And to explain the difference, I'm just going to add a quick new layer to show the difference between the brushes I'm using. So the basic brush I've been using, this one, is just the paintbrush in my default brush set. The next brush we're going to use is called the blender, and you can see it here. This is the tool presets panel, by the way. By default, that's found in Windows and then under, where is it? Tool presets down here. And I anchor it to the left just so I can quickly go between my brushes. Otherwise, you can also click up here and the tool presets panel comes up when you click on that arrow next to the little brush icon when you have the brush tool selected. So I'm going to select the brush blender now. And as you can see, if I bring the size up to a similar size, the texture is very different. And it looks quite gnarly and a bit nasty and yucky. It almost looks like you're drawing with a dry Copic marker or something like that. But I'll show you in a moment why that's a good thing. The other brushes I have, just so I can show you while I'm demonstrating the differences between them, I have my details brush, which as you can see is much sharper and smaller. And we're going to go through adding details later. And then I also have the large brush, which, as you might imagine, is basically for slapping down large areas of color. So they're my default paint brushes, and I only have 4. My paintbrush, my blender brush, my details brush, and my large brush. We're not going to use the large brush, but we are going to use the other brushes, and I'll demonstrate their use now. Well, the first one I'm going to be using now is the blender brush. So the reason why that gnarly look, that doesn't look very pretty on its own, is a good thing, is that when I alt click with my blender brush selected and select one of these colors, when I paint between them, it's much smoother. So doing the blending is going to be a lot nicer. So when I go forward in this third step of painting and do blending, I add a new layer and have my blending layer at the very top. And that way you can also hide and bring back your blending layer to see the difference between what you had and what you have. So again, this is one of those repetitive processes where you alt click and paint a few strokes, alt click, paint a few strokes, alt click, paint a few strokes, and it's really repetitive. I'm just keeping my thumb on the alt key, painting, and I'm spreading out, I'm gradiating between these colors and making it as smooth as possible. But as you can see, just by doing this, very quickly we get a much smoother skin texture while maintaining the naturalistic look of using custom Photoshop brushes. So it still looks like it's painted, but it starts to look a lot nicer and a lot more intentional. And already if I hide and bring back my blending layer, you can see how much of a difference this blending step makes just to that area of skin that I've done now. Now, keep in mind, you want to alt click a lot. The temptation might be to alt click once or twice and then just sort of paint broad areas, but really you want to move with the skin tones. And it may be too that you want to alter the saturation throughout the skin as you go. So for example, if I want to add some makeup to this character, I might alt click an area of skin and then add a touch of pink saturation. And then with my blending brush, sort of lightly paint this in here. Do the same by bringing the color down, again with a little more pink saturation. But really you want to move with the tones as you go. You don't want to stay in one tone because you want the skin color to sort of be organic. So I'm alt clicking quite a lot. It might not be apparent as I do this video, but I am. There are other things too, like the shadow in the mouth. Usually there's a bit of a shadow between the nose and the sides of the mouth. And if you do that in the blocking phase, it can look really ugly. That's okay, and it's good to put that in, but I usually like to leave it to the blending phase because it means that it's going to be a lot softer, and I can select these slightly darker and slightly lighter tones and then just lightly paint them in. So I'm still keeping as accurate with my shading as possible, but it's a lot less ugly to look at once you place it down. And if things are a bit rough, you can blend it and smooth it out. It'll soften those transitions. So this is the sort of thing that might be tempting to just keep going and blend endlessly. You can, of course, do that and it might aid your picture, but you also don't want to overwork it. So at this point, I'm gonna stop and step back, maybe just add a little more light in this area here. But that aside, I'm happy with how this has turned out, and I'm just gonna show you the difference. Hide and bring back my blending layer, and you can see the huge difference this step in the painting does. It really smooths everything out and makes it a lot more appealing. Okay, now I could do the same with the hair, and I might just a little bit, so I'll add one more clipping mask layer to the hair and just alt click and select some of these layers, blend it a bit. But really I don't want to do it too much with the hair because it's nicer to have a bit more of a rough texture. So I'm only going to minimally blend the hair, like so, and that'll do. Really, I don't want to do much more than that because the next step is where I add details, and that's going to bring the hair out a lot more than blending will. So step 4, as I just mentioned right now, is detail. And as you might have guessed, I'm going to be changing my brush to my details brush. Now again, I like to do this all layer by layer. So I have my blending layer, and on a layer on top of my blending layer is going to be my details layer. And going to my details brush, I'm going to select my lightest area of skin tone, and I'm going to go even lighter, just a touch, hit OK. And this is where we can add extra lighting sources, texture to the skin, different colors and tones and highlights. This is where we get to really make it all pop. Basically, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the tutorial, we have one main source of lighting, but usually when you're in an environment, there's light bouncing off of all sorts of things. And one of the things that adds a lot of depth to an image is to add some rear lighting, some lighting that's sort of bouncing off the edge of the skin from behind the character. So now we're going to add some backlighting, and we want to control where that goes. We don't want to overuse it. We want to specify basically where that's going to be coming from. So similar to how we had a rough idea as to where the main light or the key light is. Basically with the backlighting, I might think to myself, I'll do it in the top left areas, just on the very edges like this. So that way I won't go too far into the bottom areas. Down here, I won't go down here, but here at the neck, I will paste down, and then here along the collarbone. And that's sort of it. As you can see, it's pretty subtle, but I don't need to do any more than that really. So now this could carry along a little bit to the right side of the skin here, and sometimes it's really nice to have a little bit of backlighting in the areas of the character that are quite dark. It really helps bring things out and pop it a bit. So for example, if I add just a touch to the jaw, like that can really make it look like that side of her jaw is just catching a touch of light from behind her. And that might be all you need just to help the image pop. So as you can see, it's really not much, but if I hide and bring back my details layer so far, it's already adding quite a lot. It's in this details layer that we can also do things like add highlights to the lips. So as you can see, I've selected the lip color, and I'm gonna go to a much lighter pink and just paste down little highlights like that. And that adds quite a lot of gloss to the lip area. And that's about it for the skin tones. I'm really happy with how that's come about. And now we're gonna do details in the hair. And as you might imagine, it's gonna be a little bit different. So I'm gonna add a new layer, and rather than use my details brush, which I could use, I could bring the size down and then slowly go through all of this and add it hair by hair. But rather than do that, I've created a brush called JAZZA'S Texture, Hair and Fur. And as you can see, it basically does that line by line method, but a lot quicker. So this enables me to select darker areas first. I'm going to select this darkest tone here, and then very lightly rough in some of these hair textures. So we want to follow the grain that we've pre-established, and we don't want to go too far into the light area with our dark tone, but we do want to be a little bit pervasive and interrupt some of these highlights with our shadow tone to add this hair texture. So even in some of the lighter areas, we will have our very dark hair tone come in here. And don't worry about that too much, because now we're gonna add some light hair texture. You'll notice how useful it is to have these clipping masks, because if I didn't, there would be lines going everywhere at this point, but it's really nice to keep everything in. Now, in adding the next layer of highlights, I'm gonna actually add another layer to the hair clipping mask and select my lightest color and go even lighter. And that way, when I place down my highlight lines and textures, it's just gonna be on top, so that if I want to erase something, it won't get rid of the darker lines I've already placed. But basically, when I place down these really light highlights and texture lines, I'm doing it in the direct path of where the light source is coming from. I'm not going too far into the shadows, but it is on top of the shadows I've already placed and the hair texture I've already placed. So once I've done that, the last thing I like to do with hair texture is go to a really, really, really light, almost white color, and in a few select areas, very directly facing the light source, add some highlights. And that just makes the hair look a lot shinier and fancier. And that's basically it. As you can see, very quickly and very easily, we've created a hair texture that looks detailed, but really wasn't that hard to do and didn't take that long. Now, as far as the details layer goes, I like to add one more layer to a hair layer, and with my really light color selected, go to my details brush and then manually paint in a little bit more. So this is where I go to the edges and I can add my edge lighting. And this is where we're getting highlights caught from behind where the character is, a light source behind the character. And we're following the same pattern we set up with the skin, where it's sort of in the top left direction. So I might follow here a little bit, go inside the hair just a touch, so we can see the hair is catching the light, but we don't want to overuse this. We just want to use it in the parameters that we've already sort of established. Now, as I mentioned before, in these areas that are darkest, it can be really punctuating to use some of this rim lighting. Again, don't overuse it, just use it to garnish your image. But we have already sort of established that there's a little bit of a light source behind this character in the right as well, which we've used on the skin, so we can, in a pretty subtle way, use this on the right side of the hair of the character as well. So that's it for the hair, and if I hide my details layers, you can see there's a huge difference between before and after I added the hair texture and and rim edges and highlights. Now I have neglected to do the eyebrows, but you don't need to go as crazy with the eyebrows. You can just sort of go in there with your details brush and then very roughly shade some shadow in, and then grab your highlights and very roughly shade in some highlights. Now, some of you may have noticed I haven't really touched the earring or the eye yet. So now that we're in the details phase of the painting, we can add details, add our shading. So I'm just gonna go to my paintbrush and I'm gonna lay down some shadow in both the eye and the earring. And because they're pretty negligible sections, they're nothing too fancy, it's pretty easy to just put down the areas that need to go down, and then we can do the same sort of techniques as well, add some rim lighting where we want to. Now, as far as details of the eyes goes, something else I like to do is shade the eye itself. So often we think to ourselves the eye is white, so we don't need to do any shading in the eye, but that's not true. The eye, well, while the eye is white, it's still a surface and has shadows cast on it. And most often we have shadow cast in the very top of the eye like that. And then we might want to smooth that out and even add a lot darker tone immediately under the top of the eye. But it is reflective and it is often very light, so we don't need to go too crazy with it. So there you go, and that is the details section done. So that's step 4 done. And you may be asking yourself, what is the last step of the painting? It looks finished. Well, the answer to that is refinement. And you may need this step or you may not need this step, but this is a step where we might accentuate textures, we might add broad highlights and shadows. So we'll go through a little bit of that, but basically we're pretty much done, to be honest. But there are some things I want to do. So for example, I'm going to add a layer to the skin clipping mask, and with a pure white and a large paintbrush, I'm just going to remove the sharp edge of this character, and I'm gonna softly encroach, and then with my blender, I'm gonna extend that. And this is just establishing a nice soft transition between the painting and the canvas. Now you can do this at the start in the clipping mask layer itself, have that area that you're painting inside have a soft entrance like this, but I'm just doing it after because it's easy enough to do. Now, what are some other areas that you might want to add refinement to? Well, let's say the skin, for example, I might want to add a subtle texture. Okay, so this is a folder I have of a whole bunch of different textures, and sometimes I like to go through this and find something that might work nice as a skin texture. So this is a bit of a leather texture that might work. Sometimes paper or plaster textures work nice as skin textures. You can experiment with a few of them. I'm gonna try this plaster texture because it's a bit softer than the texture I was looking at before. And I'm gonna add it to the skin clipping mask. And as you can see, it's laid it over the skin. Then I flick through the blend modes until I find one that works nicely with the colors. So I'm just flicking through. So this one here, soft light, works quite nicely. It's a bit of an improvisation process, but once you find one that works well with the skin tones, just lower the opacity until it's barely noticeable. So you can hide and bring that back, and that can be a nice way just to add a touch of subtle interest to the piece. Now, it might be nicer in a different blend mode, for example. So if I go to color burn, I might make this really low visibility. But as you can see, that actually is quite nice because it brings out some of the warmer tones in the skin, adds a little bit of contrast, which is nice as well. So in a way, you can refine your piece with texture overlays too, just to help bring out the colors and add a naturalistic feel to them. And you can also drag the texture placement around until the textures on top of the skin sit nicely with what you've created. You could do the same with the hair, but I quite like the texture that we've got there already. And then the last thing I like to do as far as refinement goes, I'm going to delete my construction layer. I'm going to select all of these layers, duplicate them and merge them, merge layers, hide all of the layers underneath. And as you can see, I've got one layer, which has all of my artwork so far. And one of my favorite things to do to finish off a piece is go over here. As you can see, there are two tools under this little panel here. There's the dodge tool and the burn tool. So I like to start off with the burn tool, which if I click and hold over it, incrementally darkens or heats up and burns the image. And I like to go around the edges of the shadow areas and just subtly burn the image. Now that's a bit strong, so I'm going to undo that and I'm going to lower the exposure of the burn tool to say 20%, make it nice and large, and then just subtly add a little bit of burning. And this is just going to slightly further accentuate some of the shadow tones and some of the transitions into the darker areas of the skin. You can also use this in areas of the hair to add some contrast. So at the moment it's all pretty gradiented, and I can use this burn tool to add a little bit more of a random transition between some of these areas. And then the other tool that complements the burn tool is the dodge tool, which, as you might imagine, does the exact opposite. It really makes the highlights pop. Again, I'm going to lower the exposure of this tool to 20%, and I'm just going to bring out the lighter areas. Now, I'm not going to overuse it. I'm just using it in specifically areas that are in direct contact or in a specific direction of our light source. So these highlights in the hair, and it is going to make these areas pop. The other cool thing about having it all in one image is I can go up here to image adjustments and change the hue saturation, and I can, if I want, bring up or down the saturation. If I bring it up, you can see that everything's a bit golden at the moment, so I might want to touch this to make it more pink. So let's go -4 in my hue, and then I'll bring the saturation up by, let's say, 8 points. Hit OK. If I undo and redo that, you can see that it's added a bit more of a pinker skin tone. I might even bring up the saturation a touch more. Let's bring it up 10 more. Hit OK. And that alone has made quite a drastic difference. In fact, I'm going to unhide all the layers underneath it, and now I can hide and bring back my refinement layer, and you can see quite clearly the difference that my refinements have done. How quite easily with a subtle texture overlay, some dodging and burning, and some hue saturation tweaks, we get a final image that is nice and rounded, really clean, and ready to be put in whatever context you've painted the image for. So going through this whole process step by step, we begin with our flat colors and setup, then we move on to our paint blocking. The next step, step 3, is our blending, then we add our details, and then finally our refinement. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I do my 5-step Photoshop painting. I hope this video has been useful and enjoyable and educational to you. Make sure to check out the other video tutorials on Draw with Jazza and subscribe if you haven't. And also the reference file for this video tutorial is for free and it's in the description. So if you want to use this file and break apart how I've done this, you can check that out. Otherwise, that's it for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to some more content you might like. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible industry-standard creative tools such as Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the arty party, and until next time, I'll see you later.